All right, so we are back with our second panel of the day. This session is data governance and classification. Our speakers for this panel are Vicky Haley, Nick Deshpande, and Kyle Lai. And our moderator for this session is Alaz Balani. Alaz, you can take it from here.
Great, thank you very much, Vicky. Appreciate that. I'd like to ask all the panelists if you feel comfortable to go ahead and turn on your cameras. I'm going to just share my screen. And for those of you who are participating from an audience perspective, please feel free, ask questions. Let's make this interactive. It's a really heady topic here on data governance and data classification. What we're going to do is, as the panel discussion unfolds, we're going to update the content in the slides that you see in front of you. So this could go in a number of different directions. But before we get started, I think it makes sense for us to introduce our panelists. I'm just going to go down the screen that I've got here. So Nick, if you want to start by introducing yourself, please.
Good morning and good afternoon. So that's quite exciting, Alaz. You'll be updating the slides as we go. It's like a choose your own adventure in data governance. I'm excited. Great to be with you, Nick Deshpande. I'm in Toronto and work for a company doing outstanding, innovative things in the MDR space called Arctic Wolf, and look forward very much to chatting with yourself, Kyle, and Vicky today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nick. And Kyle, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about who you are, your background.
Great, yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Kyle Lai with KLC Consulting, President and Chief Information Security Officer. So KLC, we are a security company that help defense contractors mostly comply with DoD cybersecurity requirements. So I've been in security for over 20 years. Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kyle. And Vicky, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Thank you, and apologize for not showing a picture, but you won't be able to hear me if you have both. So anyway, I'm a certified management consultant, have been so for decades. I've primarily been involved in systems and software engineering in the standards world, in SC27, SC7, lifecycle models, information security management systems, and so on. And also most recently participated in 37,000, which is governance of organizations, and 38,500 series, which is also IT governance, which includes data classification and so on. So it's really interesting because governance wasn't a word that we used 30 years ago, but here it is. Thanks, Alaz.
Yeah, no problem. It's very interesting. And folks, my name's Alaz. It's a pleasure to have you. I work for Security Compass, and my focus at Security Compass is very much external focused to try and see what we can do to expand the body of knowledge around security, to help share, collaborate with folks. And I've had the privilege of working with each one of our panelists. So this should be fabulous as we go forward. So I think, when we talk about data governance and we talk about data classification, when it comes to product security, there are a lot of areas that are emerging related to privacy, related even to DevOps, and how we could go and produce products that have the right test cases with meaningful data. Things like that begin to emerge. Even when we take a look at data lakes, for example, we look at AI. All of these things intersect in some way, shape, or form with data governance and data classification. So there's a profound impact on the way that we release our products and support our products once they're out in production. I think the first thing that we should do is let's talk about what is data governance, what is data classification. As Vicky mentioned, this is something that's wasn't really there historically, but it's becoming more and more important now. So what is it, and why is this so important? And what I'd like to do is maybe, Nick, you can tee us off with this, give us your thoughts and ideas, and then I'll go down the panel.
Sure, Alaz, I'll try to kick us off here. So, governance overall, what does it mean to an organization, small, medium, or large? Basically, what standards do we want to apply to a given area, and how do we ensure those standards are meeting the mark? Meaning, whether it's driven by any kind of external requirements, regulatory, legislative, or things that we might consider to be a best practice for the organization, right? And we need the mechanisms to sort of check that we're doing the things that we commit to doing, commitments to our customers, to our partners, et cetera. There's a broad group of stakeholders that companies now have, and data kind of drives that home. Consumers have enormous expectations when it comes to how companies are going to handle their data, and we see laws and patchworks of laws try to address that relationship and kind of impose governance requirements on organizations. But just to cut right to the chase, what is data governance? Data governance is how we choose to operate the data lifecycle and manage data throughout its existence in the organization in order to conform with those standards and best practices.
Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting you bring up the life cycle. This is the whole life cycle, and the challenge is trying to take the whole life cycle and intersect it now with the product life cycle, and we'll get to that. So Kyle, you have thoughts on this? What is data governance, data classification? Why is this an important topic that we should be thinking about from a product standpoint? Oh, you're on mute, Kyle.
Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, so when we are talking to different clients, right, the first time they actually bring this topic up is like, we don't know that we have too much data. We have all the data we have in the world, but we don't know how to actually identify, classify. We don't know what's important, garbage in, garbage out. We don't know what we have, right? And how to classify it. So we need to have a data owner. We need to have the, stewardship and all these in place, right? So if you don't really know what kind of data, how to classify this data, you have to define some of the classifications so you understand what type of data you have. And not all data are equal, right? Some are more important, some are regulated, some require compliance requirements. So yeah, and so it is very important to have the data governance. And when you have, data governance usually means you have a better, leaner, cleaner data, right? So to help you make your business decision fast, right? In this world, that's going to be all competitive advantage. So yeah, it's actually make it data governance even more important.
It's interesting. And we already out of the hopper, we've got a question that came in. How do we integrate data governance and classification processes into our DevOps product lifecycles? Hang tight, that's the next slide. We are getting to your question. Let me just give Vicky a chance to respond to this question here as well. What is data governance and data classification? Why is it important to us from a product perspective?
Thanks, Alaz. Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at what governance is per se. Governance is that oversight. It's the direction from the, the governing body or the higher ups or whoever has the level of accountability to know how to ensure that what is being done can be evaluated and performed as it's supposed to be done. And so when we see this focus on data governance, it's like, why is there suddenly that there? And it's because if you think about it from a systems perspective, we're seeing the layers develop. We didn't know we needed governance until we started to see the problems by not having it, by not knowing what kind of data should be protected, what kind of data should be made available to the world, and those kinds of controls haven't really been visible before the need to make them visible. So we're in this situation now where, we're taking this systems view, we take these further steps back and we see these different lenses. And data governance is really, we have all this data, suddenly it's ubiquitous, it's being used, it's got value, it's got assets. How do we manage that? And how do we do that responsibly so that we don't get into trouble with our stakeholders, with users, with privacy laws, with the regulators? And all of this is critical to ensuring that that organizational purpose, whatever that is supposed to be done, that it's been done in the right way. And so when you look at what is data governance, it's controlling how the outputs of a management system are going to be working. When we've used historically information, we're now dialing it back and seeing what are the consequences of data. And really, it's just another asset. So it's like data classification aspects of it are really a digital version of asset management.
Interesting. You talked a little bit about the layers. Can you just probe into that a bit, Vicky, for those that may not be familiar with the different layers of governance? What did you mean by that?
Well, sure. As we heard from Nick, this is something that that organizations are using. There's value to it. There's something that has to be put in place. And so what does that look like? It's now that we have the internet, we have this sharing, that we're able to see that there's different contexts of use for that. I mean, data has been used since forever, okay? Whether it was manually collected data or whether or not it's now in this digital form. And what we now have is this capacity and capability to do so much more. And that's where the focus is, because now it's not just the negative sides that are showing up in terms of, you know, this is potentially hurting somebody because we didn't put this control in place, but there's also the leverage of opportunity and innovation. Now there's so much more to learn and know. And so how do you do that without layering it? And that layer is as a result of both the structure of knowledge. As you start to learn and discover, data becomes information, etc. And it's also within the organization's capability of managing that information. How do you integrate that into your overall purpose? And we've seen silos historically where, you know, one department has their data, but nobody else knows or touches it because it's their data. And now we're getting into these layers where you have that micro focus, but then adding those systems perspectives, you see the different systems, you get the layers in that as well.
That's interesting. So let's move on now and talk about this integration. Now that we've got some idea and we've level set what data governance is, classification, it is important. We're seeing the emergence of new ideas. We've got a lot of data. We need to somehow manage this in a way that is appropriate. The challenge now is we've got this software development lifecycle and product lifecycle. These things are all moving at breakneck speed to help us deliver things quickly for competitive advantage, to go in and try and offer services, to try and offer new features, to try to innovate. And it's all aimed at trying to help propel the organization forward. So it's a good thing. The challenge is trying to integrate DevSecOps now with data governance and classification. So I'd like to take a step back and say, what do you think of when you think about integrating the two together? You can talk either from the perspective of these are the problems that I've seen, or these are the solutions that I've seen. But let's start to open this up a little bit and dig deeper now into data governance and classification. And I'll start with you, Kyle, and then I'll go to Vicky, and then I'll wrap up with Nick on this.
Yeah, yeah, and so I think nowadays I think there are quite a bit of regulatory requirements, right? And I think I'll just start from that perspective. Is that the regulatory, there are the security integration to the DevOps, everything have to go fast, right? The developers, they want to go fast, and there are a lot, for example, just like vulnerabilities, right? If we're actually talking about vulnerabilities and what are, how do you actually prioritize those type of data, right? And some of them are going to be more important, some of them are going to be less. What kind of vulnerabilities are going to be impacting the regulatory, something that's more real, or something that's impacting the privacy, for example, and also, what type of information that you're protecting that are going to be more related to the data sovereignty, for example, right? So these are a lot of these type of concerns that we have to actually take into consideration when we're talking about the data governance. And when we're creating the products, when we're creating the software or whatever systems that we have to really dig into these type of regulatory and privacy and just something cybersecurity related item.
Yeah, and so when the time comes to inject this into the pipeline where our developers and our operational teams are executing, we have to be able to take these requirements that are related to governance and classification and be able to provide the guardrails in such a way that when, for example, a developer looks at it, it may be that we want to think about data at rest and it needs to be encrypted, as an example. So if that's the case, then we need to give prescriptive guidance to talk about what specifically do we mean by encryption for data at rest, not just leaving it at that high level, but being able to pull it in, and then the ability to go in and test that and make sure that that is in fact functioning. And I'd like to to probe a little bit on the automation capabilities as we start to look at data governance and classification schemes, for example. So thanks, Kyle, for your thoughts. And I guess, Vicky, you want to provide some of your insights based on what you're seeing in your experience as well?
Sure. When I do audits, what I typically find is exactly what this questionnaire is trying to accomplish, is how do we integrate? Because often what you see is DevOps, and then you have all of these governance policies and processes and data classification procedures, but they're different. They're siloed and they're not talking to each other. And so that's a really good question, because DevOps is all about volume, and it's the velocity. And how do you slow that down in order to start to classify your data, make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do for the governance practices? And it really is going back to process mapping, understanding what your processes are doing, and then overlaying what you were talking about, those controls. Because ultimately you have to have a data classification system going in. That's going to give you that input to the activity and the outputs. It's going to govern everything. We heard earlier Kyle talking about garbage in, garbage out. And that piece of it is where you start the governance process, is at that input level. And that means your data is already classified. You've already got the rules and the policies that are expressing what the conformities and the compliance needs to be in order to ensure that as that input flows through the process, it's not going to be out of bounds of any regulatory requirements or any organizational policies. So that overlay of the data classification is something that's an ongoing, as data changes, as it goes through that life cycle. You're really looking at your DevOps model, and you're looking at your data life cycle, and you're merging them to put the controls in the right place. And that's the only way you're going to get that integration in that operability.
So you talked about classification, where we go in and we identify and we classify pieces of data. When we talk about data, it could be really any piece of information. We talked earlier about vulnerabilities, for example. There's some really sensitive information in there, and the question becomes, how do we provide the right information back to our developers for what they need to do to move quickly? But at the same time, there has to be some governance, because there may in fact be regulatory requirements that suggest we cannot share private data about an individual. Is that the type of thing you're talking about here, Vicky, where we talk about classification and overlay that in the processes that we've got with DevSecOps?
Yes, because ultimately, first of all, you have to understand what is the raw data, because that raw data can be combined, manipulated to do any number of different things. Then it combines into a set of information that's usable by the organization. So the protections happen at the raw level. And that's where you have to make sure that those controls are at the right places in those processes. Because if you have the unclassified data coming into your DevOps processes, you have no idea what's going to happen. And if you then start to compound it with more advanced technologies like AI, where there's advanced machine learning, and there's also machine learning based on not just the data, but the experience, that's when you start to get into the black box and losing track of what's going on. So it really does start at that input level.
Interesting. Nick, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I certainly do. I'll pick up exactly where Vicky has left off there. I totally agree, and kind of the overlay, but I'll also come at it from the underlay point of view. So I have the privilege of working on our platform where I work today. And so as a platform team, we're here to enable all the product teams that are building and deploying on the platform, whatever those services may be. And to those teams, as our key stakeholders and partners, we tell them, hey, we're going to handle some of those data governance and classification concerns so you don't have to. And then when Vicky comes in to do an audit, she can come to the platform team and do checks there in one place and verify many, rather than go to each individual team and say, okay, how are you handling your data? They get to turn around and say, well, we actually leverage the platform in order to do enforcement and controls of our data. You know, products that we ship today emit a lot of data, whether it's from user input or otherwise. Could be telemetry to do with how that product is running. That's of extreme interest to us, and it's of big interest to potential attackers as well. So we want to be able to keep track of that data, govern it, really have it in the right place for the right people to access for the right amount of time. And so again, that's where a platform can really come in and you enable teams to operate at scale. So one thing I would push back is, you know, I don't know it's necessarily about slowing down enough to integrate, but I think we need to be able to catch up with DevSecOps with some of the controls and checks that are happening at both the platform level and also, as you mentioned, Altaz, in the pipeline itself. You can instrument a lot of checks in the pipeline to ensure that code that is being merged is conformant and meeting standards and meeting requirements. And the last thing I'll just bring up is the notion of compliance as code, right? From the very beginning of that development lifecycle, I think we're going to get to that in a moment, so I don't want to get too ahead of myself, that the more you can express your requirements and compliance as code for developers to use as kind of building blocks as they build and ship their products, then you're going to have a much easier time when it comes to those pipeline checks and much greater confidence that it's going to be able to merge and ship successfully.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up. So now that we when we talk about DevOps, trying to create a digital representation of physical artifacts that we used to have historically, for example, compliance documents, being able to take that and push it through in a digital format, I think is it's helpful insofar as we can now have machine readable artifacts that show us the posture of our governance processes. Like, are we in fact adhering? Are we going off? And we can catch these things through the metrics that essentially get pushed out. Now, there's a separate discussion altogether on what do we do with all of this data that's coming out of our log files, and how do we make sense of it, and how do we begin to aggregate all that? And that in itself is got its own problem space essentially. But that's an interesting comment that you bring up, and I think I would say that's a really key piece of trying to help us move and get in line with where DevOps is, which is to try not to slow them down, but try to bring governance and classification to the teams rather than telling them, here's our sandbox and you need to come and play in our sandbox, so to speak. I'd like to talk a little bit about scaling this out across the product lifecycle. And what I mean by that is there may be a supply chain here that's vast. It could be open source. It may be small companies, large companies. And I know, Kyle, you've done a bunch of work with trying to bring companies alongside, if you take a look at the work in the Fed space, the DoD space, I mean, the supply chain is just massive, right? And yet we're trying to produce products that are essentially getting aggregated along the way. And as we do this, we may find that there are inconsistencies in how we manage the data. There may be aggregation happening that Vicky was talking about, that we may end up tripping on something. Can you help us understand from your experience, right, at that kind of scale, how do you integrate DevSecOps and data governance and classification for something that is, like really vast and pretty complicated? Where do you even begin with something like that?
Yeah, so from the DoD and the third-party supply chain kind of a perspective, I think the very first thing is data classification. Back to data classification, because we really have to understand, like, what type of data are we actually passing down to our supply chain, the subcontractors, right? Are these sensitive? In the DoD, right, sensitive or control unclassified information, or are these classified information? These are going to be very important, or these are just like federal contract information, right? They are sensitive, but they are not sensitive enough that you have to put in all the 110 controls, right, for like a NIST 800-171. But these are something that it's something that's on the contract. It's not meant to be going to public, but it's not sensitive enough that you have to do the protect with a significant protection. So how do we actually identify what type of information is considered control unclassified information, or what type of information is considered contract information, or what type of information are just public, right? So we don't care. And also in the commercial world, the other thing we have to understand, when we're classifying, not just the data, it's really classifying the data, but you also have to classify the company that handle the data, right? So, and because it's going to be important. If this company is in the financial trouble, it doesn't matter, right? This company is not going to protect the data. So we went through that back in 2008 when a lot of financial companies were really going through the bankruptcy, right? A lot of companies. So when we actually said, oh, data governance, think it the other way. It's like data governance, are they going to be able to protect it? If they are not, then that's no point to actually talk to them about data governance. Let's talk about the financial stability first. But these are just some broader perspective. But in terms of the data classification itself, once you identify these are the data we're going to pass down to the third party, right, subcontractors, you really have to identify, put it on the contract and make sure that these are the type of requirements that the contractor have to comply. And you also have to make sure you are marking and labeling your data properly, because otherwise, hey, this is considered sensitive, but it's like, I don't even know why, where does it actually say it's sensitive, right? If you don't mark it properly, then whether it's on the paper or it's on the electronic, you have to have a way to mark it, identify the type of data, what type of sensitivity it is, and have an agreement in terms of how to protect this type of information. I think these are going to be something that is very, very critical when you're talking about the supply chain.
Yeah. So let me just poke a little bit further, Kyle. So we've got a supply chain. This may be a vast supply chain. We've gone and we have identified the data within the organization and we've classified it. How do we exchange this information? Is it typically done where we go in and we create like separate data repositories, and it's like you could now go in, when it actually comes to implementing this stuff, is that generally how it's done? Is it something that's done where we layer on security practices to go in there, like zero trust, to try and prevent access to certain pieces of data? What are you seeing?
Yeah, definitely. There are obviously many different ways of doing this. You can create your own enclave where you give the contractors like the virtual desktop interface, right, the VDI, so they can connect in, but you manage as a prime contractor, we manage everything. Or you can actually have a zero trust, have only people that are validated can access this data. All the data have to be encrypted. There are different ways of implementing this, but zero trust, I think it is a zero trust architecture. This is something that's a little bit more getting more popular. It's a concept, right? But in terms of how do you implement it, is still a challenge for different companies, especially for the smaller firms. I think I still see a big challenge for them.
Yeah. Hey, hold that thought on zero trust. We're gonna get to that eventually. But let me just turn to Vicky for a moment. Vicky, you've done the auditing stuff for decades at this point. If you have to come in and look at data classification, and there needs to be evidence that classification has in fact taken place in line with where DevSecOps teams are moving very, very rapidly. When it comes to the operational aspects of it, right? We've got, you talked about the different layers. So at a high level, we will classify the data. When it comes down to even like the systems level, for example, is it fair that we might suggest that auditors should come in and take a look and even see within our data repositories, where's the data coming from? How's the data leaving the system? Is it being encrypted? Do these kinds of discussions begin to emerge even at that project level, at the systems level?
Oh, they have to. Otherwise, it becomes far too late later. And audits at the project level are often useful to be able to determine whether or not the data classification system is robust enough, for example, whether it's ubiquitous, or whether or not it's just a policy that's not implemented. So yeah, you're going to follow that whole, in a typical project, you're going to follow it from the inception to look for whether policies are in place. You're going to look for instantiation of evidence that's actually been done. There's sign-offs, that there's understanding in the training for anybody touching that data, that the rules for compliance are in place. So it really filters right through the entire project.
It's interesting that you bring that up as well. Let me just make a note of this. And what I'd like to do is let's move on to the next slide here. Sometimes when we talk about DevOps or DevSecOps, it's usually in the context of looking at just software. But there are a whole slew of products out there that are really hardware based, but they've got this software layer called firmware. And we need to still ensure that we've got classification, we've got governance that helps even from a firmware development perspective. So Nick, I'm just going to ping you for a moment. I just would like to understand from your experience, when you look at hardware products that contain essentially a component that has software in it, and the firmware can be developed, rapidly, and we go in and we continue to push out updates and things like that. But should we be thinking about data governance and data classification at that firmware level as well?
Certainly we should. And we think of hardware products, they can run the gamut from something that are meant for kind of broad consumer market, or even some things that might be highly sensitive and part of something critical infrastructure, for example. And so that's going to determine as well the approach to how you might bake the firmware and check its fidelity and run updates. So some companies might be required to operate a fleet in the field just to ensure that devices can be properly managed and maintained, for example, when they can't be flashed or reached over the air. But yes, I think that's probably the easy answer to say those things definitely need to be thought of, even in the case of firmware, which again are giving off and producing their own kind of unique types of data, which can tell you a lot about that product. And again, the sensitivity of that data needs to be taken into account in terms of how it's protected, how it's encrypted on that device, which again is not in your control, not inside your physical perimeter. And you need to be able to manage that accordingly.
Interesting, Kyle. I see you nodding your head. This happens a lot where we've got procurement scenarios and something has come in and it may be something that's managed. It may in fact be something that we've got in our own infrastructure. Your thoughts on products that also include firmware and the idea of data governance, the whole data lifecycle. What are you seeing? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. When I think of the product that's with firmware, IoT, right, Internet of Things or industrial Internet of Things, those are in the critical infrastructure. Nowadays, though, we have more, atomic, autopilot in the self-driving cars. For example, there are going to be a lot of sensors in critical infrastructure. They're going to be having a lot of these type of IoT with firmware. And these are the things that I think, in the past has been overlooked, right? And to be honest, how many people are actually upgrading the firmware, right? And I think nowadays, I think the education, the training, I think awareness, people are a little bit more aware, like, firmware, that's something that's real, right? If you have IoT out there, you really have to keep up. And which means that firmware security, software security is really applied to the firmware as well. And also these data that's managed passing through these devices, with the firmware, you really have to go through the risk, the threat modeling, the risk, and understanding how do you actually, what type of data are going through, what classification, and also what kind of a specification that you have to put in when developing these firmware, because they're really critical.
Interesting. Vicky, have you ever come across anything that's related to firmware that's built into products, and then trying to determine the classification, whether it's the firmware code itself or data that passes through a particular physical product that contains firmware elements in it? How would someone go about beginning to assure that we've got the right governance and classification with something like that?
Okay, 15 questions at once. Okay. No, let me just say that I totally agree with what Kyle's saying, because the Internet of Things is now ubiquitous and it touches every level of society, whether it's a baby monitor or whether or not it's a sensor in a nuclear operations. And I think what is really critical is that people understand that it's a system. And so it requires just as much control, even though it may be out there and it never may be decommissioned because it'll just go into the garbage. It has the capability of every other system. And if it doesn't have the controls, then you can imagine what kind of exploitation can occur with that. And that's what we've seen when the Internet of Things first exploded, with all of these devices and then these interactive loops that really consumers are excited about because they get to have some control over it, that control really isn't obvious. And so that's where you get into data management and data governance in the design, in the architecture and the design of these products. Because if you don't consider how that data can be exploited and abused, then you're not fulfilling your fiduciary duty to the consumer or to that end user, whoever that might be.
So you go in and you essentially try to build this stuff in from the ground up. So Vicky, I mean, you've been involved with standards groups as well. Is there guidance available on how to bring some of this in? Like, where do people start when it comes to governance and classification?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because if you look at the ISO IEC world of SC 27001, and that whole body of information security standards, in trying to develop big data security standards, a huge gap has been identified that there are no data specific security standards. They're all meant to be for information and data and treat them interchangeably by putting the controls in place. But if you're looking at something like DevSecOps or DevOps or AI, and you're looking at big data sets, what we're learning is that there are some subtle differences, and that has to be yet determined in the standards world. What are those differences that say this is a data security specific standard that we can deploy irrespective of the kind of environment? So there hasn't been a lot of work done on that and in the standards world, and it's just starting to come out that is something that you really start to look at information as being the composite of data. So you can protect the information, but what do you have to do to protect the data itself? And that really goes back to understanding what it is, classifying it, categorizing it, and then modeling it according to the use of that particular system.
Interesting. Okay, let me just move on to the next question here. People want to learn more. There's stuff related to zero trust. There are things in there related to emerging models, things related to even how we exchange data, the velocity of the data. In some cases, we might be able to go in and stream data from one system to another. In some cases, we have to go a little bit further. We have to think about, how can we transfer vast quantities of information from one system to another, for example, and data sharing and those kinds of things. With all the stuff that's going on and all the changes that are happening, Nick, I'd like to ask your thoughts. How could a team that is considering this idea that they want to put together a good, solid data governance, data classification program in place, what are some of the things that you think they should be doing to begin to initiate the process?
Absolutely. So there's tremendous opportunity, and the sooner an organization gets started, the better off they will be. It's really hard to play catch up in this area, just due to the volumes and how fast things are moving. So yeah, a company should pursue a data governance maturity model, one that's tied into their overall efforts around integrated risk management, and really at the end of the day, should determine how they derive value rather from their data, such that it's not a liability. It really should be part of your business outcomes and tied to your business model. And that comes from, you have to cultivate those expertise and create that culture, which both Kyle and Vicky spoke to earlier, create those experts and invest in that training. But the one tangible thing I would certainly put out there that is I've found is both kind of timeless as well as technology agnostic is actually looking at ISAC as COBIT 2019, right? The most recent iteration of COBIT, where you're going to find a objective around managed data, and it's going to give 58 activities that an organization kind of follow and use to bolster a program related to, as I said, a data governance maturity model. So that's kind of one sort of very tangible thing I wanted to leave with this group.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kyle, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, so my thought is that different industry have a different focus and a different mission, right? Objectives, because the data is very different for different industries. And I think it's better when you are starting the data governance, you have that focus, objective, right? What we are trying to achieve. If you are in the retail, it's going to be very different from energy, right? Because the energy, they might focus on the how they flow the energy, right? And in the retail, they really want to have the business analytics, right, to boost their sales. So that's going to be important. And also, I think you really have to define the responsibility, right? The roles and responsibilities. That's going to be very important. Who is the owner? Because if you don't really define the owner, then I think nothing is going to get done, right? That everything is going to fall apart. So, and also there are several things that you have to cover in the data governance: the data protection, data quality, integrity, right? The security, privacy. But you probably want to prioritize, because if you try to put everything all at once, I think it's probably not going to be possible. But what is the most important, right, for the company? Because some company, if you're in the critical infrastructure, the data availability is going to be, trump everything, right? Safety, right? And but if you're actually in like auto or industry, that probably is going to be the data quality and the integrity, because you don't want anyone to mess around that data. So I think, with that, identify what are the priorities and what type of data you're managing, and how that's going to support your company better. I think that is going to be, that's what I thought.
Yeah, Vicky, do you have thoughts on helping to construct this program that can bring in data governance and classification as we move rapidly forward, and as we look at innovation and product delivery?
Sure. I have bias, of course. I would recommend standards. I would recommend starting with ISO 37000, which is governance of organization, and they have one of their principles as data and decisions. So it really goes into what an organization should do with its data in terms of creating it as an asset, making sure it has its controls and protections, as well as using it as an opportunity driver. Having said that, I would recommend any type of management system, whether it's 27001 or 9001 that focus on quality, just have a structured approach, a systems approach to looking at the organization, the programs within it and the projects and the life cycles, and attach yourself to some structured methodology for putting that in place, because it doesn't matter what standard or methodology, whether you take a maturity model, which is a good idea, or a management system, which really kind of places you in the middle of that maturity model and sets you up to continuously improve. So if you do that, what you're doing is you're setting up a structured approach to setting up your management system for your data, how it's going to be used, the privacy components, the input controls, and all of that. And that gives you the ability to start to measure and manage in a consistent way. So it really doesn't matter what you do, as long as you start to do something structured, and you can pick and choose, whether there are better models downstream, but get yourself in control to begin with.
Yeah, I just want to add that when we talk about data lifecycle, I think that we talk about, but we never defined it. I just want to say, when we're talking about the data lifecycle, you really have to kind of follow through the data lifecycle from the input and creation of the data, right? To actually where do you store, how do you use it, who do you share, where do you share that information, then archiving of the data, and to the destruction of the data. Once you flow through that data lifecycle and how it passed through your organization, then you are going to be able to find out your assets. Where's the data assets and your system that touches this data? Once you identify them, you know your scope, and then you can focus on how to manage your data.
That's great. There's a really interesting question that came in from our audience. When we look at data, we also have to classify aggregate data as well, right? So you've got sort of these discrete atomic data units, and then we want to start to kind of build that up a little bit. But there may be so many different permutations and combinations of how data might potentially get aggregated. Is there a way to scale this kind of approach effectively? Should we rely on what's at the atomic level? Do we rely on what happens at that next level? And I think it touches a little bit on what Vicky opened us up with, which is around the idea of classifying in different layers. But what happens if we start to have this fan out effect now, where we've got so many permutations and combinations, we might have this work and that not work, and it depends on who gets access to it, but it begins to now get really complicated. So I'm
Nobody
going to
said
open this.
governance is easy.
We're done. So, any thoughts on how do you tackle a problem of this magnitude? You may not get to a perfect state, but how do you begin to take a look and say, yeah, we're actually moving in the right direction here? Does anybody on the panel have some thoughts? I'm just going to open it up
Can I
to
jump in?
the three
Yeah.
of you. Vicky,
I'll
go
jump
ahead.
in on that.
Yeah.
And this is the perfect audience for it, because it's, if you imagine the automation process, what do you have to do to get there? It's a computation. You have to understand the manual process. You have to put the rules and the parameters in place, and then you just automate. It's all going to be relationships based, and it's all going to be directional. In this context of use, the data can be used this way. In this context of use, it can't. So it's going to be a decision-making process with any type of data, but in order to make it automated, you just have to follow that same process. But it's all the prerequisites of automation.
Yeah, and also I think, once you actually get into that level, you really have to consider the broader picture ethics, right? And also the model, the fairness on the model, right? And if you actually have a autonomous car, right? When you actually see just a really bad example, but I think I'm going to use it, right? You see a bunch of people in front, maybe like 20 people, right in front. Are you going to, you actually gather this information. Is the decision going to run into these 20 people or steer you to the wall? I think these are going to be some, kind of ethics and kind of the bigger picture, the algorithm, the models, right? Data models that we have to think about, because I think everything's going to be automated at the end, but I think these are some of the real things that we have to take that into consideration.
So now what's happening is it's not just about having a consistent management approach and having like a program that we can put around it, but it's also looking at the necessary control points at the point of aggregation and what are the decisions that need to get made. And at that level, we start to decide where in the fork this is going to go. Now, it's easier said than done, totally get it. But this seems to be what's emerging from the discussion that we're having just now. Nick, you've got some thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I sure do. And I certainly would want to leave the group with just one more buzzword, but that is data lineage. This is where data lineage plays such an important role. And you sort of mentioned the atomic elements that might make up any aggregated data set, right? Mm-hmm. So does it inherit, the mean of all the classification of sensitivity of that data, or does it rise to the highest level of sensitivity? Maybe. It all depends on that data, but maintaining the lineage, I think, is really key to understanding what the aggregate data poses as far as, whether it's a risk or opportunity to the organization, and it's probably both. But aggregation can be, also done in order to reduce the fidelity of data, right? You sort of get to lower resolution data through aggregation. You're removing some elements of that data because potentially you're doing trend analysis, you're doing mean, median, average type calculations. So, you can now maybe expose data that you couldn't previously because you've aggregated it and you've taken down its sensitivity. So again, I think as the person put it, millions of permutations, and that's certainly true.
Can I just add to that, Alaz?
Yeah.
Really good point that Nick made, and extending that further is data provenance. And if you look at the sensitivity of that information, even to just because you have it, you may not be able to use it for other things. And a good example of that is the focus on Indigenous data and the provenance of that and the misuse of that. And there's an IEEE standard that's looking exactly at that. Because even in aggregation, you may have to be forced to take out some types of data based on provenance rules.
So you brought up data provenance, Vicky, and some eyebrows may be raised because of it. Can you talk a little bit? What do you mean, data provenance?
I'll use the example of Indigenous data. If you think about what we've heard in the news about cultural appropriation, just because something is shared with you doesn't give you the right to use it or to exploit it or to copy it or anything else. And so there has to be a level of acknowledgement of the origin of where that data has come from and whether or not it's actually even permitted to be shared. And so data provenance goes to try to sort out what those rights are. Because again, just because something is there and available doesn't mean it's available to be used or exploited.
Okay, so we've just got a few more minutes left, and I would like to get to one final question and see if we can make a round on this. We've spoken about sort of an ideal approach, right? Go in, use this model, use this tool, use this framework to go out. When reality hits, many times we end up with roadblocks, hurdles. There are things that really prevent us from achieving what it is we're trying to do, yet we still want to try and inch forward. So what I'd like to do is open it up now as a final question to the three of you. When looking at product development, product delivery, and data classification and data governance, what are these landmines that you have typically seen? And what are some of the things that can be done a priori ahead of time to help mitigate some of the stuff as best as we can? So really looking for experiential advice here. Where have things blown up and what could have prevented this, or maybe there's nothing that could prevent some of these issues. So I'll start with you, Nick, and then I'll go to Kyle, and then we'll end with Vicky.
Thanks, Alaz. I think it's worth investing time into developing and really understanding the data model for your product and how that data model will change over time. And so that comes down to kind of a catalog of the data that the product both, relies on and needs, whether that's in the data tier or coming from external systems through integrations, but also what data is generated by the product at runtime, right? Whether it's, again, user generated, whether it's, telemetry from the product, but really getting that data model right and then making sure it doesn't go stale will help a product team understand how to respond to and ensure that the controls that have been applied are the right ones and are effective, because it is too easy to lose sight of, data that might be generated, data that might be shipped out somewhere that perhaps you don't have immediate control over. And so now you might have a retention and life cycle problem. But I'll just put that out there for consideration around having a really good grasp of the data model for your product. Great, thanks. And Kyle, your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, I believe it's the data classification. Once you actually create a policy procedure, you really have you have to keep the data classification simple and intuitive, right? Don't overcomplicate it, make it like 15 classification. That doesn't really work. But keep it like 2 or 3, maybe 4, something that's very simple, people get it. And also once you define that, train your users, right? Train your people, the staff, so they understand, because you have this classification. If they don't understand how to apply it, give them some examples so they can grasp how do they classify these type of data. Once they get it, it will make things a lot easier. Follow the procedure. That will be a lot easier.
Interesting. So when we talk about data classification and training, Kyle, from your experience, have you seen any training that can help, or is this largely bespoke training that each organization would develop internally for their own context?
Yeah, I think, because the classification, I think is going to be a little bit different based on the industry as well. So it's better to have a company develop their own examples. I think the example is going to go a long way, because these are, the HR data, the Social Security, these are the type of data, or the healthcare, this and that, healthcare related information. How do you actually classify this information, right? And salary information, what do you classify? So give them that type of concept, right? So now they understand when they see this type of data, they know what to do with it. And I will say internally develop the training I think it will go a long way.
Yeah, that's great. Just before I get to Vicky, I've got one question for you as well, Kyle. Who should be kind of overseeing this training around data classification and governance? Have you seen a CISO typically do that? Is there a chief officer, like, data officer? Who generally spearheads that initiative?
I think it's really, I've seen all different sides of the company, different type of company. They all have their own. Larger company tends to have the chief data officer, but they also report to either CIO or CTO. So I think I see different, but I will say there are, sometimes the chief compliance officer, but I think I don't think it really matter which role actually have this responsibility, but you really have to define the roles. Who is going to be the ultimate data, or responsible for the data, the classification, the data governance. Data ownership is going to be critical.
That's great. Thanks, Kyle. And Vicky, just to round it off here, your thoughts, your final advice on landmines, what to watch out for?
Yeah, it goes back to my earlier comment about taking a systematic approach, being structured, because you need to have the controls in every aspect of that life cycle. And typically governance is from, the idea right through the decommissioning, whereas, DevOps is only looking at, okay, now we have the data, what do we do with it? It's been classified and how, but it goes beyond that. So it's that full life cycle, making sure that you take into account both the early stages as well as the end stages. Because, for example, if you don't have a way to decommission or destroy your data, you could end up in violation of all kinds of privacy laws because you're retaining it beyond certain retention periods, et cetera, et cetera. So having said that, though, then it's a matter of tackling each and every one of those processes, because this is all process based. And so if you have that kind of a structured approach, it's like, if you've ever built a road, that the big stones come up, these things are going to surface. And those are the things that in DevOps start to slow things down and start to prevent the velocity from maintaining itself. So having that structured approach that enables you to continue the velocity while still maintaining progress and speed is down to having structured processes where you can go in, fix something without disrupting your overall operational flow. So having that structured approach, because the landmines are going to surface everywhere, because that's just life.
Great, thanks. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. It's been an amazing conversation. There's so much that we tried to unpack in such a short period of time. I also want to thank all of you that listened in to our conversation. Please feel free, if you want to reach out to anyone on this panel, feel free, reach out on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've got any further questions, don't hesitate. We've got some a Q&A opportunity in the platform as well. And with that, I just want to say thank you and appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you next time.